Elijah Beckett found the horse by the river, bleeding and broken, its ribs showing and eyes clouded with pain. He chose to save it, not knowing this animal was far from ordinary. By morning, the empty hills around his ranch would fill with silent riders, and Elijah would stand alone between his home and a storm he never intended to call. He lived on Redstone Ridge, far enough from town that most people forgot he existed. Past 40, with broad shoulders worn thin by years of hard labor, he carried himself like a man who expected little from the world. His beard was streaked with gray and dust, and he kept his eyes down unless there was reason to look up. He spoke sparingly, not from unfriendliness, but because words had long since lost their power. He had once worn a Union uniform long before the Ridge grew quiet. The war took years from him. The winter of '76 took more. His wife Marion died slowly from a fever that filled her lungs. The child she carried never arrived. After that, the house felt hollow, and so did Elijah. He stayed because the land was all he had left. People in Dry Creek called him the Quiet One. He rode into town only for supplies, flour, coffee, liniment for aching joints. He nodded to the storekeeper, tipped his hat to the widow at the post office, and left before conversations could start. He was never seen in the saloon or the church, and that suited him fine. The house on the ridge still held fragments of another life. A faded wool scarf hung over a chair. A small broken cradle sat under a layer of dust by the window, carved by Elijah's hands the winter before Marion died. It had never held a child. It gathered silence instead. Late March arrived harshly that year. The wind still cut like January, and clouds hung low and bruised in the sky. By noon, a biting northern wind drove ice and dirt against the windows. Elijah finished his chores early, chaining the gate, shutting the barn, and hauling water from the stream behind the house. On his second trip, he noticed something dark near the far edge of his property, where the snowbank met the brush along the river. At first, he thought it was a fallen log, but the shape was wrong. He set the bucket down and moved closer, squinting through the stinging sleet. What he saw made him forget the cold. A horse lay crumpled in the snow, little more than skin and bone beneath a torn gray hide. One foreleg was twisted beneath its body. Dark blood clotted along its belly and leg. Steam rose from its sides in weak, ragged breaths. One eye was half open, dull with pain, but watching. Elijah knelt beside it, the wind tearing at his coat. He placed his hand on the horse's neck. It was still warm, still alive. He worked carefully, checking the leg, the ribs, the deep cut below the belly where old and fresh blood had frozen together. The bone felt intact, but the swelling was severe. As he leaned closer, he noticed something unusual. On the horse's forehead, half washed away by snow and mud, was a red spiral mark. Around its neck hung a braided leather cord strung with 3 small carved bones. Elijah had seen marks like that before, years ago, in stories from passing traders. They were not mere decorations. No human tracks showed in the snow, only a deep slide mark leading down from the icy bluff above. Whoever owned this horse was gone or had been forced to abandon it. Elijah hesitated. He scanned the ridge, but there was nothing out there but wind and white land. The horse met his gaze, not begging, not fighting, just there. "You're stubborn," Elijah muttered, "or lucky." He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the horse's shoulders. Then he fetched a wool blanket from the barn. It took nearly an hour of dragging, coaxing, and rest stops to get the horse on its feet. Elijah's bad knee burned with every step, but he kept going. Together, they staggered toward the barn. Inside, Elijah settled the horse into an empty stall, one meant for a mare that hadn't survived the winter. He lit the small stove and warmed the space as best he could. From the house, he brought his wife's old jar of salve, a mix of bear grease and wild yarrow. He bathed the wounds with warm water, speaking low and steady, the way he might have spoken to a frightened child. The horse barely moved. It shivered, snorted once when the pain flared, but did not resist him. The cut was deep. Elijah stitched it closed with careful hands, steady from years of necessity. He wrapped the swollen leg with crushed comfrey and strips torn from an old flour sack. Outside, the storm battered the barn walls, making the boards groan. When he finished, Elijah stroked the horse's neck and whispered for it to rest. He left water within reach and scattered hay, more for comfort than strength. He sat with the animal for a long time, watching its sides rise and fall. He didn't know whose horse this was. Maybe it wasn't meant to be found. Maybe it was meant to be left. But something in the way it breathed, stubborn and steady, kept him there. That night the snow fell heavy and quiet. Before going inside, Elijah pulled another blanket over the horse and added wood to the stove. As he closed the barn door, he glanced back once more. "You survived," he said softly, "just like me." He did not know that by saving that horse he had crossed a line older than the ridge itself. The snow stopped sometime after midnight. Dawn came thin and grey, pressing cold against the house. Elijah rose early as always. He stirred the embers in the stove, poured black coffee into a chipped mug and stood at the window. The land looked wrong. Everything was too still. No rooster crowed, no hens stirred. Even the crows were silent. Unease crept up his spine. Elijah pulled on his coat and stepped onto the porch. The cold bit deep, but it was the silence that unsettled him. As he moved toward the barn, his boots creaked loud in the frozen snow. Then he saw them. At first, they were only shapes along a fence line on the far slope, shadows where there should have been open land. As the light grew, the truth settled in his bones. Horses and riders surrounded the ranch. Mounted men stood in a wide crescent, faces painted, bows and lances held ready. At least 100 of them, silent as stone, their breath rising in pale clouds. Elijah did not reach for the shotgun behind the door. He did not run. He stepped forward unarmed and stood on the porch between his house and the riders. At the center of the line sat a man on a white horse, still and watchful. A wolfskin cloak hung from his shoulders. His gaze was dark and sharp, older than anger. Elijah understood them. The horse in his barn was not lost. It had been taken, and whatever came next would not be decided by guns or walls. The circle held. No one moved. The morning waited, and Elijah Beckett stood his ground, unaware this was only the beginning. The circle of riders did not tighten, but it did not break either. They waited as if the land itself had given a command to stand still. Elijah felt the cold sink through his boots and into his bones, yet he did not move back toward the house. Turning his back felt like surrender, and surrender felt like a mistake. He would not survive. The white horse at the center stamped once, slow and deliberate. The man riding it remained still, his eyes fixed on Elijah. He wore no paint on his face, but his presence carried more weight than all the markings around him. Elijah had heard the name whispered in Dry Creek, spoken carefully by men who knew better than to laugh. Natana, a chief who did not waste words. Minutes stretched thin. The wind stirred loose snow across the yard, whispering around the posts and fence rails. Elijah thought of the barn behind him, of the wounded horse lying in the straw, breathing slow and steady. Unaware of the reckoning gathering outside, at last the chief lifted one hand. It was a small motion, but it rippled through the riders like a signal passed through wire. A path opened through the crescent. Natana guided his white horse forward, stopping just short of the porch. He did not dismount. "You took what was never yours," he said. His voice was calm, low, and carried easily through the cold air. There was no shouting, no threat. It did not need either. Elijah swallowed. His mouth felt dry, but his voice held when he spoke. "I didn't take him," he said. "I found him broken by the creek. Left like that, he would have frozen before nightfall." A murmur moved through the riders. Not anger yet, something closer to disbelief. "That horse is Takakota," Natana said. "He is not a stray, he is a warrior, sacred. No man outside our blood lays hands on him." Elijah nodded once. "I didn't know his name, I didn't know who he belonged to, I only knew he was dying." A younger warrior shifted in his saddle, fingers tightening on his spear. The tension sharpened. Elijah felt it like a wire pulled tight across his chest. Natana's gaze never left Elijah's face. "Ignorance does not loosen the bond," he said. Some lines are not crossed, even by accident. Elijah said nothing. He had learned long ago that arguing the past rarely saved a man in the present. A new sound broke the stillness. Hoofbeats, light and measured, approaching from the right side of the circle. The riders parted again as a woman rode forward on a bay horse. She was young, her posture straight, her face unpainted. Her eyes were sharp, not with anger but with purpose. She dismounted and walked past her father without a word, straight to the barn. Elijah turned slightly, watching her go. No one stopped her, not a single warrior moved. Whatever her place was among them, it was one earned. She opened the barn door and stepped inside. The barn felt warmer than the yard, thick with the smell of hay and salve. Takakota lifted his head at the sound, ears flicking. He did not shy. He watched her calmly. She knelt beside him and began to examine the wounds. Her hands were sure, gentle. She touched the stitches, the wrapped leg, the salve Elijah had used. She paused at the leather cord around the horse's neck, her fingers resting on the carved bones. Elijah stayed near the door, his heart beating hard. He did not speak. After a long moment, she stood and walked back outside. He healed him, she said, her voice carrying clearly. He did not bind him. If Takakota did not choose to stay, he would not be here. A stir ran through the riders. Some frowned, some looked uncertain. Natana turned his head toward her. Choice does not erase trespass. No, she said, but it reveals truth. She looked at Elijah, then really looked at him, not as an enemy, not as a thief, but as a man who had made a decision and lived with it. Silence fell again. The wind tugged at Natana's wolfskin cloak. For a long time he said nothing. Then he dismounted. The movement surprised everyone. He reached into his saddle and drew out an eagle feather bound with red leather. He stepped forward and pressed it into the frozen ground between himself and Elijah. No man holds the spirit of a warrior without being measured, Natana said. You will ride Takakota to Windcollar Hill. There the truth will be known. Elijah's chest tightened. He had heard of Windcollar Hill, a place of old burials, a place outsiders did not go. If you are false, Natana continued, the horse will throw you and your blood will answer the debt. If you are true, you will return alive. There was no room for refusal. Elijah nodded once. Then I'll ride. A murmur rippled through the circle. The young woman watched him closely. Something like approval flickered in her eyes. Elijah turned and walked into the barn. Takakota stood waiting. Elijah approached slowly, speaking under his breath. He placed the saddle gently on the horse's back. No bridle, no rope. He mounted with care, settling his weight easy. Takakota did not resist. They stepped out into the yard together. The riders parted in silence, forming a narrow path. No one followed. This test was not meant for witnesses. The trail to Windcollar Hill was rough and cold. The land rose in long, uneven slopes. Snow thinned as they climbed, revealing raw earth and stone. Takakota moved with quiet strength, choosing his steps without command. Elijah trusted him. The wind grew stronger near the top, cutting hard against skin and bone. When they reached the crest, Elijah dismounted and stepped back. Takakota walked away from him. Elijah held still, his heart pounding. If the horse ran, it would be over. Takakota stopped, turned, and walked back. He stood beside Elijah, calm and steady. Far below, the riders watched. The verdict was clear. The ride back down was quiet. When they reached the base of the hill, the warriors parted again. Natana nodded once. The horse does not lie, he said. Today you live. The riders turned away, melting back into the land as quietly as they had come. Only the young woman remained. Her name, Elijah would learn later, was Aayasha, and nothing on Redstone Ridge would ever be the same again. 3 days passed after the trial on Windcollar Hill. The snow melted into thin crusts that cracked underfoot, and the land began to smell of thaw and damp earth. Elijah Beckett returned to his routines because routine was the only thing that ever steadied him. He split wood, mended a fence, and hauled old hay from the far shed. The ridge felt quiet again, but it was not the same kind of quiet he had known before. On the third morning he heard hoofbeats. They were slow and steady, not hurried, not cautious. Elijah straightened and shaded his eyes. A lone rider came over the rise near the sycamores. It was the young woman from the circle, Aayasha. She rode a bay mare with a tired gait, her posture straight despite the long road. There were no warriors with her, no painted faces, no weapons raised, just one woman riding into his land without asking. Elijah did not reach for a gun, he did not call out, he simply waited. Aayasha dismounted near the barn and untied a small bundle from her saddle. She led the mare toward the lean-to and settled her there as if she had done it 100 times before. Then she turned and began working. She carried water. She shoveled old straw. She split kindling with careful hands. She did not explain herself. Elijah watched for a while, then went back to his work. By noon, it was clear she was not visiting. She was staying. The first days passed with few words. Aayasha followed Elijah's lead, watching how he moved, how he worked. She learned the rhythm of the place without instruction, where tools belonged, which boards creaked, which horses needed gentler handling. She did not ask permission, she offered help. Takakota lingered nearby, calm and watchful. The warrior horse no longer paced or tested the fences. He grazed, lifted his head when either of them passed, and went back to feeding. He seemed content in a way Elijah had not seen before. Work filled the daylight. Silence filled the rest. It was not an empty silence, it was shared. Aayasha learned the herbs Elijah used, watching him grind roots and leaves into rough salves. She learned which cuts needed stitching and which needed only time. When a young calf took sick, she stayed up through the night with Elijah, holding the lantern while he worked. They did not speak of the past, but slowly, without planning it, the house began to feel less hollow. One night a hard wind swept the ridge. The shutters rattled and the fire burned low. Elijah and Aayasha sat on opposite sides of the room, each with a mug warming their hands. The wind howled outside, pressing against the walls. Elijah stared into the fire. "My wife died in winter," he said at last. His voice was rough, unused. Aayasha did not move. She listened. "She caught a fever. I was gone when it took her. By the time I got back, it was already done." He swallowed. "She was carrying our child. I built a cradle that never held anything." The words fell heavy into the room. Elijah did not look at her. He did not need to. Aayasha waited until the silence settled, then spoke. "I was promised to a man I did not choose," she said, "for peace, for alliance. My silence was expected." She stared into the fire, her face calm but tight. "I left because I wanted my life to belong to me, even if it meant being alone." Neither of them spoke after that. They did not need to. The fire burned lower. The wind eased. Something between them shifted. Days turned into weeks. The ridge softened with spring. Grass pushed through the thawed ground. Birds returned to the trees. Elijah found himself fixing things he had ignored for years. A loose step, a broken latch, a shelf thick with dust. Aayasha hung herbs to dry. She tied a strip of red cloth above the barn door, not as a mark of claim, but as a sign of care. They worked side by side. One evening, Elijah carved a small bone bead while Aayasha braided willow cord. When he finished, he slid the bead across the table. She picked it up, turning it in her fingers. She did not ask what it meant, she kept it. Late summer came warm and dry. One morning, they rode into town together. Takakota carried them calmly through the streets. People watched, some stared, some turned away. The sheriff stepped out of his office, hand near his gun. "She's here by choice," Elijah said quietly. The sheriff studied Aayasha's face, then nodded once and stepped aside. Inside the store, the shopkeeper traded without comment. An old woman remarked that rosemary was good for fever. No one told them to leave. That was enough. On the ride home, Elijah spoke. "We don't need their welcome," he said, "only that they don't send us away." Aayasha nodded. "It's enough." That evening, as the sun sank low, Elijah found Aayasha repairing a saddle in the shed. Her stitches were even and strong. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Maybe you should make your own saddle," he said, "if you plan on going your own way." She looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Only if I plan on leaving," she said. "If I stay, I'd rather ride with you." He sat beside her. They watched the hills burn gold in the setting sun. Takakota stood nearby, free and unburdened. An eagle circled overhead, riding the wind. Aayasha smiled. My father said, when an eagle flies above you, the earth does not claim you. Elijah glanced at her. And if it flies above two people, she considered, then maybe they choose to stay. The light faded. The wind stirred the grass. Elijah rested his shoulder lightly against hers. She did not move away. They did not speak of love. They did not make promises. They stayed. And on Redstone Ridge, where silence once meant loss, it now meant peace. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more tales like this. Like the video to show your support and share it with others who might find it meaningful. Thank you for listening.